Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Best of Breed. Harry Mosley, CIO for Zoom. Welcome to this session. I'm joined here by my esteemed colleague. We've got Cal, the CTO and co-founder of Slack. So welcome, Cal. We got Dia, the Chief Product Officer for Octa, and we got Paul, the Global CIO for Box. So we're going to have a dialogue this afternoon. We're going to have a discussion up here. But I would like to open this up to the audience at large right from the get-go. So as we're sort of talking about topics, if there are comments that you have, questions that you have, we're not going to wait till like the formal Q&A when we get to the last 15 minutes. We good with that? And if we don't get questions, I'm going to come around and sit down with you and sort of say you've got a question. So good. So why don't we start off with introductions. Cal, if you could.
Sure. Hi, so I'm Cal Henderson. I'm, as you said, one of the co-founders and the CTO of Slack. So if you're not familiar with Slack, we're a messaging app for Teams. We're also a pretty happy Zoom customer as well.
Good. How many hands up for Slack customers in the room?
Okay. And so we've been making Slack for a little while, although it started out completely differently as a video game company that very differently that didn't work out, and we turned it into a company based on the tools that we built for our own team to make us productive. So great to be here today.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. Dia Jolly, I'm the Chief Product Officer of Octa, as Harry said. Octa, again, for those of you who do not know, is an identity platform for corporations. It's the only independent and neutral identity platform out there. And we cover all identity use cases that any organization might have. So from from identity for your employees, to your partners, to your customers, all the way through.
Paul Chapman, that was fast.
Paul Chapman. Just before Paul goes, we really rehearsed this extraordinarily well, by the way. Spent countless hours on this.
Paul Chapman, Global CIO and Technology Officer at Box. It's interesting because I always have these conversations with people. What is it you think Box does versus what we really do? And often we're misclassified because we actually formed a category many, many years ago and led that category for many, many years. But we've evolved much more into a cloud content platform today. 30 billion API calls a month, ingesting 40,000 files a second now, 25 million queries a second processed, massive adoption, 95,000 customers, 70% of the Fortune 500 across every industry. I also, outside of owning the IT function, also own the trust office at Box, including security and risk and compliance. And when you have customers like the FBI, the FCC, Department of Justice, those are the sort of things that keep you awake at night for sure. So.
I know a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Great. So it's really clear that the business landscape is changing around us as we speak. I fundamentally have said for many years now that every company is a technology company. We're either, like us up here, building the technology, or you're running on the technology. But without the technology, everything comes to a standstill. So, and we also know that sort of the technology landscape is changing exponentially at sort of a fierce rate. When we think about all these changes as IT leaders, what do we see as some of the major business and workforce trends? What are we seeing in that sort of regard?
I think from my point of view, the two biggest trends over the last decade have been kind of proliferation of software and consumerization of IT. So proliferation of software, the now pretty famous Netscope survey from a couple of years ago that said the medium-sized enterprise was using 1,600 or 1,700 apps, and that's only continued to increase since. The idea that that any kind of sizable organization buys software from one or two large vendors is just a thing of the past, right? The part of that is driven by the kind of cost dynamics of SaaS, that you can now start a SaaS business for way less capital, so you can have much more niche software. So in the past, where software was in a few broad categories, there's now ever more specialized tools that you can use for different parts of the business, different roles, different functional areas. And in each of those categories, and the number of categories is only expanding over time, the choice is going up and up and up as well. So there's been this massive proliferation of tools, and I don't think it's definitely not slowing down. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. On the kind of flip side, on the consumer side, for a long time, kind of software and technology in the workplace was the kind of cutting edge of technology development. That flipped around about 15 years ago, somewhat with the rise of the smartphone, somewhat with the rise of the web, that the kind of cutting edge of technology became on the consumer side. And that changed people's relationship to technology a huge amount. And a lot of that really driven by the smartphone, that people have something that they interact with every day outside of work, and the kind of consumer expectation of what it is to interact with technology, the bar just keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And so what people come to expect from the tools that they use in the workplace is now based on their consumer experience rather than their previous workplace experience. I think that's driven a lot of the kind of change that we're seeing in software tools in the workplace.
Fully agree with that. The flip side is also that anybody who has a smartphone now is a technology expert, right? So that's the other challenge that we have to deal with.
I would add a couple of things. I totally agree with Cal. I would add a couple of things to that. I think because of the proliferation of software and devices, there is also a trend for people to want to work from anywhere. More and more people work outside of what you call the traditional office or corporation. And they expect their experience to be seamless, right? So that's one thing we're seeing more and more and more of. And the Bay Area is actually epitomizes that. The other thing we're seeing a lot more of is as technology is becoming more mainstream, as there's more applications, more devices, more and more security is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. More and more threat actors are rising up in the industry. There are more and more breaches you look at. There are more and more hacks you look at. So how do you take all this complexity and protect it is becoming top of mind for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, and I have this phrase that I like to use, which is, what's a vacation now? It's work from another location.
I don't like to use that.
You like that? Or
No, I don't like that.
You don't like that?
No.
But isn't it true?
Somewhat.
Okay.
It's true. They say the slowest rate of change we'll ever experience is the one we're experiencing now, right? It's not going to slow down anytime soon. And you sort of get comfortable with being uncomfortable with the rate of change that we're dealing with. Prior to being at Box, I was at HP, and if you can think of maybe two more contrasting companies, it's not one is right, one's wrong, just born at different times, a different way of thinking, different way of operating, different way of behaving. Box, born in the cloud, grown-up digital company, influenced a lot by consumer experiences, much more of a new style of worker, one that was grown up digital, right? Educated by Apple and Amazon and Google, digital native base. Which leads to a new style of workplace, actually. It's much more open, much more social, much more collaborative, and you have to have a new style of sort of IT to support that environment. Work is a state of mind, not a place you go to. So to your point, I guess that makes sense, right? And so it's interesting when we do a lot of studies into the future of work and what does the future of work look like. In fact, we did a future work study with Slack and Octa, actually, where we brought together some common customers that we have. We each have large install base of customers, and we brought common customers together to try to understand really why some companies were being successful, some companies being unsuccessful with their transition. And I'll just say the one thing that, and we can touch on this a little bit later, is one thing that really rose to the top was that culture and technology are inextricably linked in terms of organizational success today.
Great. One of the things I like to talk about is that 2/3 of the world's population are millennials and Gen Z. And this is a group of people that grew up on mobile devices, grew up in the connected world, grew up in the digital world. There's three things that I've noted about this population of people. One is that they are a culture of the sort of instantaneous access. They want it now. They want to be able to connect now. They want the response now. They ask you something, they're looking for an approval, they're looking for some guidance. They want it now. They're not really interested in having a meeting to discuss it. They want to be able to reach out and touch. The other thing is that they've redefined sort of what I classify as the connect and chat. I don't know about everybody else in this room. It's like I grew up in an era that if I chatted with somebody, that was a conversation I would have. My kids don't think of chat as a conversation. They think of chat as a digital transmission of content from one person to many others on different devices around the globe. On the other hand, when we talk about connect, that's a very different term, because connect is to connect to someone, to see that person, and to be able to hear that person, and have an immersive experience. So these are terms that I fundamentally believe have been redefined by this group of people. All that being said, sort of when we think about IT leaders and the challenges as we've had, when you were at HP, when I was at KPMG or Blackstone, et cetera, it's like we had challenges back then, but the format and of those challenges has changed dramatically. So I'd love to talk about that, the change management, the culture, and what do IT leaders, sort of what are their challenges with this sort of, as you said, Cal, the consumerization of the technology. Let's chat about that.
Yeah.
And please feel free, people, to sort of raise your hand anytime.
I think one of the kind of fundamental shifts has also been the kind of erosion of the desktop operating system as the like delivery mechanism for software. Right? There used to be there was one way you delivered software to everybody in your organization, and that was you provisioned it onto their desktop machines. But with first with the rise of kind of SaaS or tools delivered over the web, and then with the smartphone, there isn't a single mechanism anymore. And whether it's kind of enterprise app stores or over the web or still on-prem or on the desktop or on laptops, there isn't really a core to like software delivery in the enterprise that there was a decade ago. There's that, and that has happened at the same time as this proliferation of categories, which has meant that work is becoming fragmented. There is no argument that we are not individually more productive as a result. If you think about the role of, say, a recruiter in the days before LinkedIn, it was a fundamentally different and much harder and much more manual job, which you could not achieve anything like the velocity you can today. Individual productivity, massive increase, but this work is now just happening in many more places and doesn't have a center to it anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely.
So I think the challenges are, building on top of what Cal said, the challenges are, as an IT leader, you now need to support a vast variety of not only apps, but like work situations. Make sure that they are cohesive, make sure that your experience is seamless, make sure that they're secure. That's fundamentally a very, very different culture than saying, oh, IT procures these 3 suites and you do everything with them. It requires IT to think much more broadly about how do you actually enable all of this differentiation, right? And how do we actually figure out how to keep all of this secure, right? And that, coming at it from an Octa perspective, that is fundamentally why identity becomes so critical, which is you at the end of the day, there is no traditional perimeter. There aren't 3, 4 application suites you can write on, right? So if you know who someone is, you know the devices they use, you know where they are, you can then try to start, the behavior that they access certain kinds of apps, et cetera, this is what they're allowed. You can start actually ratcheting up security. So I think more and more organizations from a cultural perspective are beginning to understand that they need to make this mental shift as they start cobbling best of breed applications together.
Yeah, well, I think when you mention best of breed, I think there's a modern architecture today, not a sort of traditional architecture, sort of a stack of things based on your middleware and operating systems and so on, but a modern reference architecture today is really based around best of breed, interoperability, agility, speed, flexibility, security, scalability, all of those things. And contrastingly, if I look at, say, sort of the budget that I manage today and look at how proportionally what it's spent on, traditionally there was a much heavier spend on keep the lights on, run the business, operational aspects. In today's environment, where you've pushed, you have the freedom from infrastructure, a lot of security and the trust has been federated out. It still has to be qualified, but it's federated out into the services. What that really gives you is a much higher degree of a percentage of your time is spent on change and scale your business, evolve, enhance, whatever you want to call it. And that's because of the give back of time. And that give back of time is extremely important with what you do with it. It used to be in a stepwise linear way. You'd evolve your old architecture and keep sort of evolving it. Now you're constantly bringing in systems of innovation that are maniacally focused on being the best at what they do. Octa the best at what it does, Slack at the best at what it does, Zoom the best at what it does, Box what we do. And we get the benefit today of bringing these services together in a very interoperable way to create those frictionless, seamless experiences for our employees. And if we don't take the work out of work, this will become, you talk about culture, this will become really, really hard to attract and retain our workforce if we don't provide an environment that has some freedom of choice and doesn't have friction in it, now you get your work done.
Right, I think that's a really important point, that the tools that people use in the workplace aren't like something that just happens and people don't care about. They have really come to the forefront of the experience of work, right? And that there's the long list of things that are important about the tools that we choose and what we're going to choose in them. One of the most important is how people feel about them. Like it's become a differentiator from a hiring or employee culture or workplace culture point of view of, do we use a set of tools that make people feel like they're better at their jobs, feel closer to their coworkers, feel like they're able to achieve their best work in that role. And I think that's a pretty different orientation to some extent to the role of the CIO and how that's evolved over time, right? And what the responsibilities are seen as from the people that picked the tools to meet the business needs within a budget, from facilitator. A modern CIO can't pick every tool that their business is going to use. For a start, there's just not enough time if you're bringing in thousands of applications, but also not going to be the subject domain experts anymore. The marketing automation team is going to have the best opinions on the piece of marketing automation software they should use, and the CIO is going to make sure that we're able to bring that in securely and can integrate it, that it's going to work with other tools, that it's available on the platforms that we need to, and that it meets compliance concerns. And that's a pretty different role.
Yeah. Integration architecture is critical in today's modern CIO world.
Yeah, the landscape has changed dramatically. I mean, we used to talk about this, sort of shadow IT groups, if you will. It's like, their voice today is, rather a significant decentralization of IT. And I also fundamentally believe that the role, the role of the technologist has changed because the professionals have changed too. When you look at the professionals that you hire into companies, I remember back in my days at KPMG as an example, their technology literacy when they got hired into an advisory role or an audit role or a tax role, their technology literacy was really rather dramatic, and so their abilities to be able to do things like data visualization, configure, and leverage technology was very different to how it was as little as 5 or 10 years ago, and that's going to continue to change. So the role of the technologist is exactly like my colleagues have said up here, which is making sure these things work securely, making sure that they hum, making sure that they integrate. It's kind of like the data architecture is super important. So it's fun and interesting time. I for one, I'm very happy at where I am from a point in time in a career and don't have to think about that. So it's, but that being said, a question that's being posed is, so here we are as executives in our respective companies, and here we are talking about best of breed. So when we are evaluating technologies, evaluating tools to bring into an organization, how do you, and I think we touched on some of this, but how do we identify those tools? I think some of those comments have already been made. Who wants to start with that one?
Yeah, I think we talked about a lot of the qualities, but I mean, ultimately, why we should be picking the tools that we're picking within our organizations is to be able to work better, right? That has to be the outcome. It's either to enable a form of work that wasn't possible before, or to accelerate work, or have it be of a higher quality, or have more people be able to work on something simultaneously, do work that wasn't able to be done without that particular set of tools. I think that it's, as software creators...
So do work that wasn't able to be, or do it better?
Both are possibilities, right? There's tools that can enable either of those kinds of things. But I think that it's easy to forget in our role as software creators that most people don't come into work each day excited to try a new bit of software or use their software at work. Like the creator fallacy is we're obsessed with the experience of using our tools and whether people use the features and what they get out of it. People just really want to get their work done and want us to get out of the way as creators. And so I think it's very easy to forget that the most important criteria for picking tools is whether they make people able to better do their jobs. It seems very straightforward, but it wasn't something that we talked about yet as we talk about these criteria.
Yeah, I would add a few things there. So one is, I'll give an example that completely floored me this weekend in terms of what a best-of-breed app or best-of-breed software is. I think best-of-breed software is stuff that, as Cal said, makes it very, very easy for you to do your work, right? And you want to use it. So this weekend, my kid tells me he has a play date, 8-year-old. And I was like, really? I'm not taking you anywhere. Where are you going, right? And he's like, I'm not going anywhere. I have a play date with my classmates. And I'm like, are they coming? He's like, no. He had a call on Zoom with his classmates, on
Excellent.
Zoom.
That was very good.
Okay.
I'll give you the $20 afterwards as well.
I didn't, seriously, this happened. And then he couldn't figure out the code. So my kid, and I had no clue, 8-year-old, I kid you not, he pinged his friend on Slack. I was just taken aback. And I think that's what people are looking for. Best of breed, easy to work to do. He's not like a super genius at technology or anything. He's just like any other kid in the Bay Area, right? People want that convenience and that ease. And my personal belief is like you can make your experience that phenomenal if you focus on 2, 3, 4 key value propositions, right? So that makes it a best of breed app. The other thing is if you know that you are going to focus on deep experiences, you then keep your product open so that it can interact with other products, right? That it needs to, so that you can get the use cases you need to your consumer as a whole. So it's interoperability, open APIs, and the best possible consumer experience or best possible user experience. I think that's what makes best of breed, versus tying people into this like suite where it may or may not work. Some pieces may or may not work the best. It's much more like I'm working and going to work.
Yeah, so I'll add. I think that summing that up, what we spend a lot of time thinking about today is speed, and time to differentiating value, and we don't want to be spending time on things that don't provide differentiating value. And that's sort of the beauty of what we're talking about when we talk about best of breed. It's also like I say, I don't want to overemphasize sort of best of breed services, but best of breed architecture as well, which is allowing us to take advantage of all of this innovation that's going on around us. It used to be, technology was behind where the business was at, and it was always waiting for some upgrade or some, operating system or ERP upgrade, whatever it might be. Now, technology's outstripped and outpaced the ability for most organizations to keep up. And it's because we're constantly leveraging all of these best-of-breed services that are constantly innovating. Slack is constantly innovating. Octa is constantly innovating. And we're bringing those into Zoom, constantly innovating. $10 afterwards. You got the 20 because you were first. But Box constantly innovating. We're maniacally focused, because if we're not, then freedom of choice, people will go somewhere else.
And switching costs are dramatically.
Right. Well, the on-ramps and off-ramps are a lot smaller than they used to be, especially for systems of engagement versus systems of record. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship now versus what used to be much more transactional. It's like, okay, write a check, I own the software, now I got to go implement it and make it work. Now we're constantly in a mutually beneficial outcome, because if we don't have a service that is innovating, or it's reliable, or doesn't have the right trust posture, we'll go somewhere else. And I think that that's something that we're all taking benefit of.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you hit on is with the move to more services delivered via SaaS, I think there's more and more insight into what people are actually using.
Yeah.
And so success has moved from we've signed a contract and installed this on-prem to it's now being used. And it's being used every day, and this is where work has moved to. And I think like using engagement, with the products and tools that you choose as the measure of whether they're successful is a really beneficial shift from a user and customer point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting. From a telemetry standpoint, we take features out if they're over time not used, and we replace them with other features. You go to a more traditional software that's been around 20, 30 years. I was joking to someone the other day, I said, every time I go into Excel and there's a new release, there's always some additional ribbons at the top of I've been using the same 10 features for 15 years. It's like hieroglyphics now, right? Well, maybe 10 features. They're still basic ones, but there's like so much going on in the top of that screen. It's like, okay, because they don't know what I'm using, right? So you've got this big, heavy user experience that you carry around from version to version and release to release, which we
have a lot more insight into what people are doing with those tools and where they're finding. Not where they're finding value. I think that maybe oversells what we can get from metrics. We can understand what people are doing, but not necessarily what they're getting out of that. But we have much better insight into the features and parts of the product that people use every day.
Dia, your story about, was it your son or your?
Yeah, my son.
Your son. Reminded me of a story about my younger son, Ben. So he was about 17, it was about 5 to 7 in the evening. I was walking past his bedroom door, and I said to him, dinner's in 5 minutes, don't be late. And he snapped at me, and sort of as a 17-year-old would snap, saying, don't interrupt me, I'm doing my homework. Well, sort of that's a great thing, right? You're a 17-year-old, he's a junior in high school, doing his homework, what's bad about that? Well, he was on his laptop, at his desk, in his bedroom, doing his homework, collaborating with other students from his class. That was good, right? Yeah, he had a FaceTime session going with his cousin in San Diego. That was good. He had, a chat channel going with a bunch of his friends about what movie they were going to go see on Saturday night. That was kind of like interesting. And what else was going on? Oh, yeah, and he was streaming music. But my 5-second don't be late for dinner, I was interrupting him doing his homework. That's what we're dealing with in the workplace now. Is like kids, when you look at sort of these people, these young professionals that we're hiring into our organizations, they expect to be able to sort of move from one mode to another mode very quickly and get instantaneous answers. So, a question for Dia, I'd like you to take this one. So as we introduce these new technologies and new capabilities, they come with new risks and new challenges, and we sort of see this as on a constant basis. So, really value your thoughts around this topic.
Sure, I think I sort of alluded to this before. The world, the way security happens in the world has changed significantly. You are, like we talked about, you're no longer working from your place of work. You have, 1,700 applications, you said? 1,700 applications. You are constantly working, and you expect to work across multiple devices. You are collaborating, as Harry pointed out, with multiple partners to get work done. In that world, when you think about security, as I mentioned, really the constant there isn't the perimeter, the security perimeter. The perimeter has disappeared very much, right? Like in the old days, it used to be corporate network, corporate device, right? And that's what used to keep you secure. Now, identity, like who you are, really is the fundamental primitive that you can latch on to for someone to say, if I can genuinely say, this is Paul, right? And I know this is Paul, then I am able to securely grant him access to the right applications, to the right, potentially the right information in the applications at the right time, right, with the right level of access. So I think we hear from our customers, and we genuinely believe, or we wouldn't have built Octa, that security is becoming more and more tightly coupled with identity. And not just at the time of authentication, but also throughout the experience, knowing who someone is, what they're allowed to do, what device they're allowed to do it from, where they're allowed to do it, et cetera, is really how you keep the world secure today.
Great, thank you. So we know like the best of breed is kind of like something that we really want to achieve. So how do we go about doing that? And I remember being on the panel conversation that we had, I think that was in July. Question is, how do you know when you got there? What is the best of breed? How would you define it?
Well, I don't know if it's a case of getting there. And in some ways, it's a constantly, like technology's constant change is the steady state. It's constantly evolving. We all have to reinvent ourselves many times over in order to stay relevant. And I don't think it's sort of, we've got to, I think best of breed is not really a thing by itself. It's more of a principle in some ways.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier about sort of like the constant innovation. If you're not constantly innovating.
So if you think about, Uber as an example, right? If you look underneath the hood and you say, okay, how did Uber architect its services? What's the secret sauce? Well, maps from Google, messaging from Twilio, email from SendGrid, infrastructure from Amazon, payments from Braintree. It's like, okay, they don't own payments, don't own cars, don't own drivers, don't own infrastructure, don't own email, don't own messaging, don't own maps. What do they own? What they've really done is they've said, look, we're going to take all these best-of-breed services, and they've switched some of those services out over time. When this one was, I think they used a different mapping engine at one point, maybe different payment engines. They want to get to the point of where they're focusing on the differentiating value. So to me, it's having an architecture that allows you to constantly be introducing, whether it's a new machine learning service, which we're doing a lot of at Box right now. It's introducing digital labor into your processes. It's the ability to swap out and bring in, even run in parallel these services. So to me, best of breed is this interoperable set of platforms that allow you to really bring this innovation into your environment and switch out services as well. So it's not just done; it's sort of forever evolving.
Yeah, I think, as we continue to have this kind of proliferation of categories of software, if we take we use about 500 bits of software at Slack. We're a smaller company, so only 500, which is already a staggering number. But the 500 that we use today and the 600 we use next year, it's not we're going to add 100. It's that there are going to be new categories. Things are going to change. We will find new tools that best meet our needs, or we'll pick 2 in this particular category because that's what works best for teams. And so I think, best of breed isn't there isn't a we have achieved it and now we'll tick the box. It is that we are always going to be trying to get the best possible tools to be able to move the business forward. And it's really about the results that we get at the end of that. Yeah. So sometimes it's about the work that gets done. Sometimes it's the experience of the work that gets done. Yeah. From a employee experience kind of company culture point of view. So I think that I think the idea that it's like you pick suite or best of breed is not real, it's a false dilemma. There's no company that's buying 1,500 apps from a single suite. It doesn't exist, right? So it's best of breed is how companies operate in terms of proliferation. I think then it's more about the attitude of, are you trying to get the best tools for the job, or are you trying to tick the box in each category and just provide something? So I think it's much more about an attitude of constant evolution of, are we using the best tools at this point for our particular needs as a business?
It's like wisdom of the community. I think generally most organizations settle on what are the best capabilities that they need. And across most organizations, it doesn't wildly vary. In fact, Octa, I think, is in the catbird seat somewhat to be able to get visibility into the trend in the services that people are subscribing, organizations are subscribing to, because they all go through single sign-on. And in fact, the analytics report that Octa just recently released, or feels recent, although I think it's probably a number of months old now. There's some very interesting trends and patterns that Octa see year over year in terms of what services might be dropping off, what ones are gaining momentum, gaining in popularity, and interestingly, some patterns emerging around choice as well, where you start to see it's not one or the other, it may be both. And so there's a lot of data out there to help you when it comes to the choices you need to make.
And Paul, to your point, I think you're absolutely correct. We see multiple apps providing the same kind of use case used across organizations, but then we also see the more popular apps spike in usage. So multiple apps might be deployed, but we see deployed. So for example, Office 365 and Slack, but we see Slack usage go up by like 57% in, I think 2018 was the case. So we see things like that as well.
So last question, and I do expect questions from the audience, otherwise I will come down. I'm just telling you now. So the theme of this conference is gratitude, and as we know, there's a lot of work. There's plenty of work, and the work-life balance is always challenging. So plenty of work and plenty of life, and how do you get that balance right? So what sort of fun stories can you share from each of our companies in terms of why we're grateful to be part of our respective organization? So I'll go first. How's that? So a couple of years ago, prior to joining Zoom, I committed to my younger son I was going to drive him back to college. How many people in the room have kids in college? Have you driven your kids to college? Yeah, well, my kid goes to college at St. Louis Obispo, and I live in New York. Yeah, it was awesome. It was 4,200 miles outbound over a 10-day period. Let me tell you something. If you've never driven across this great country of ours, I can highly recommend it. And I know Ben so much better than I ever thought I would know one of my children, and I think he knows his father better than any of my other two kids know me. Because we spent literally 10 days, 24 hours a day, almost like physically connected to each other, and it was fantastic. And then I drove back to New York with another friend. So I'm very grateful to Eric and the leadership team of Zoom for allowing me to take that time to spend it with my son in such a very special way, and with my friend to drive back. So it was 8,000 miles door to door, which was really very cool. If anyone wants to know more details about it, I'm the guy in the red jacket, you can find me.
Sure. So I think that with one of the kind of negative possible impacts of technology over the last decade with the rise of the smartphone has been that it's very easy to be always semi-online and never really disconnected. And I think that it's a really tempting, device is always there in your pocket. I could just respond to this one email, to this Slack message. I could just hop on this video call. It's very hard to fully disconnect from work. And I think that one of the things that we've tried to do as a company from the beginning is allow people to set good work-life balance boundaries in the office, because I've been at the company now for more than 10 years, and I'd like to be there for another 10 years at least. And so it matters that it's sustainable for people that work there. And I think really wanted to avoid the burnout culture that often happens in tech companies. And so I have set expectations with my organization, with the whole company, that it is fine to be completely offline and not respond to things. I won't send you messages in the middle of the night. Please never send me messages in the middle of the night unless it's an emergency, because I don't want to look at them. I want to be outside of work too.
Did you invent the snooze, the Slack snooze?
Yeah, so we have do not disturb, so that it's like, not only do I not receive messages, you know that I'm not receiving messages, so I'm not going to be responding to you. And setting those kind of preferences to encourage people to be offline, I think, is really important. And especially during the time that we built the company, I had a couple of kids, and now I have something to do other than work all the time. And it's really important to me that I'm able to disconnect from work every day. So really thankful that we've been able to build an organization that allows all of our employees to have that experience.
Yeah, I think for me, the work-life balance is is true that both Harry and Cal talked about, but there's another thing that I think is pretty unique from my perspective that Octa does. I've always wanted to give back to the community in some form, and I want my kid to give back, right? Like in the Bay Area, we're pretty privileged in the way we grow up, etc. And Octa is actually really good about this. Octa has this initiative called Octa for Good, where employees participate in multiple community events, whether it is helping build a house or teaching children and things like that. And it is not just encouraged, but it's actually looked very favorably on. I think it comes from our co-founders who do a lot of this themselves. So every leadership event of ours is like, we have something like this. Every new hire gets time off to do this. If you want, you can bring your family and things like that. So for me personally, that helps balance off things in a very good way that I didn't have before.
Yeah, we have Box.org and we partner very well with Octa for Good. We have a lot of very sort of serendipitous relationships that occur through those community things. I maybe I'll go to sort of some of the values that we have as a company, right? We have values like make mom proud and 10x it and things like that. But the one that probably stands out in this regard is bring your blank self to work. And you can fill in the blank, right? But it's very refreshing to have a culture where there's no judgment on how people show up at the office, what your background is, what your gender is. It's the sort of the biases that you get in sort of traditional organizations where everybody wears the same, looks the same, operates the same, behaves the same. And I think that actually creates an environment, a cultural environment, where if somebody doesn't respond right away, okay, it's okay. If somebody does, it's okay. There's not this sort of expectation thing. And to me, it's like the pain of change is mandatory. It's the suffering is optional, as I tell my team a lot of time. It's like it's not the same per organization, and there's no one single way of operating, behaving. We have given capability through tools to be able to give people freedom of choice of how they choose to show up in the office, how they choose to work, where they choose to work, and it works for us. It doesn't work for all organizations, but that's what works for us.
Great. So questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with that one. At least I'll take it first, if you don't mind, Cal.
Go ahead.
It's like, from a Zoom perspective, it's like when, I remember talking to the CIO of a firm, trying to convince him to take a look at Zoom. And his response was, Harry, when Zoom becomes a verb, I'll call you. And guess what? 6 months ago, he called me and he said, when can we Zoom? It's become a verb. It's become a noun. I'll Zoom with you later. Let's set up a Zoom meeting, etc. So that's my measure. Cal.
I think it's there's obviously a desire to really quantify that, and I think it's something that's hard to exactly quantify. But when we look at people putting like Slack in job listings to, if you come here, you will be able to use Slack, or on the other hand, when we hear from employers that candidates ask if they're able to use Slack if they join this company, then that's a very strong signal on the recruiting side. And it's like, the cost of recruiting one engineer in the Bay Area is, or the cost of like losing a single engineer is so high that covers the cost of a lot of our software for quite a lot of people. So like if it's a small impact on the recruiting or retention side, has a huge amount of value, and if you can multiply that out over a large workforce, then that's huge.
Yeah, it's tough because depending on how you've built financial models for investment, the traditional TCO and ROI model don't actually compute the same way. How do you quantify speed, agility, productivity, efficiency, employee, motivation, happiness, NPS, all those things, because that doesn't show up on the bottom line. Whereas if I spent 100,000 versus 50,000, that's $50,000 less. It's a simple math on that. But the reality of it is, to your point, there are so many hidden costs in the traditional models that you don't see, that are harder to quantify, that if you come from a sort of a CFO background that quantifies things based upon, okay, I can see the debits and the credits sort of thing, it becomes a much harder conversation to have.
But the employee morale is super
Yeah,
important.
super,
important.
yeah.
Yeah. And employees asking for technology, I've heard that many times as well. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, employees can get their job done easier. I think that's where, instead of a number, you have to point to, like, for this 25K or this 50K, here are all the things the employees feel that they can do that they could not do with the alternative technology.
Yeah, it's like, we're heavy users of Slack. Millions of messages a month. I can't quantify how much we save by having millions of messages per month, or a team. We have, hundreds of Teams channels are turned on, turned off every month. The collaboration that goes on. I don't know how you sort of exactly. I just know that there's tremendous value in the usage of and the productivity from that. It's hard.
But it's
to
not
quantify.
easy. That cultural mindset comes from the top.
I think we're out of time. We are? Yep, we're out of time. So if anybody has any questions, we can hang around here meet outside, and we're happy to take questions outside. Thank you.
Another session.
Thank you.